This book is called Nora Webster, and it's set between about 1967 and 1972. And one day I was about halfway through the book, and I realized this is meant to be the 60s. And people are going to read it and think, well, where were the 60s in the book? And I was thinking, in the town I'm from, which is in the southeast of Ireland, what happened in the 60s? You know, and then I scrolled down the things we associate with the 60s. And I remember that there was one guy called Conor Lynch who had long hair, but there was nobody else. And the town was deeply divided over him, whether he should have long hair or not. I honestly don't remember anyone having a miniskirt, but there was a woman who had a maxi coat. But that might have been it's really hard to think of the things we associate with the 60s. You know, drugs, sex, and rock and roll. There was certainly no drugs. There was no rock and roll to speak of. And sex was indoors between consenting adults, in the dark, in private. So I didn't really know anything about that either. So I thought, is there anything at all that happened that I could make clear to the reader that it was the 60s, not the 50s and not the 70s? Just to put in the book a scene where the 60s would impinge on life. And I thought, anyway, this is what I came up with. And this is absolutely true, that women, what happened really is that I think the hairdressers, there were 2 or 3 hairdressers in the town, and they got cheap hair dye for women all the same month. And it was like the autumn had come. I mean, trees just turned, or not trees, women, overnight from one colour to another. And you'd go to a friend's house, and his mother would come to the door, and you say, she just had turned orange or, blue overnight. And anyway, that's what I'm reading about. So it's just a small bit that Nora Webster is in her late 40s, and she joins the whole thing. There's a mention of Jim and Margaret. She has a really it's a conservative town, but she has a very conservative brother-in-law and sister-in-law called Jim and Margaret. And her 2 sons, who are aged 12 and 8, are in this too, and they're even more conservative. And they're called Donal and Conor, and they just appear at the end. On Wednesday morning, she went downtown and had her hair done, talking to Bernie and the hairdressers about a new system of dyeing hair she had read about, wondering if it was time that she did something about the grey. I wouldn't like it blue, she said. I know what you mean, Bernie replied. And if it was too black, then it would look dyed. And I was never blonde. I mean, everyone in the town knows I was never blonde. Is there a good brown so that it might not look dyed? I could try this one. Bernie showed her a package with a photograph of a woman with curly brown hair that looked natural. Maybe just start off with a small bit, she said. No, the instructions say to use the whole thing. I've used it before. It's very popular. You would be surprised who has it. Well, try it so, Nora said. Once the dye had been applied, Bernie put a nylon net on her head and left her to flick through some magazines. When she saw that she would not be home in time to cook a proper dinner for the boys, this time in Ireland when dinner was in the middle of the day. So when she saw that she would not be home in time to cook a proper dinner for the boys, she regretted having come here at all and knew she would have to go soon. She signalled to Bernie, who was now busy with 2 women who had come in together and appeared to need to consult each other about each clip of the scissors. I'll be right with you, Bernie said. When she came over to remove the net, Bernie told her not to worry or look too closely, as the real change would come only once the dryer and a brush and comb were used. Nora was aware that the 2 women Bernie had been looking after were studying her closely. Nora wondered if she should not have consulted other women before getting her hair dyed for the first time, but she couldn't think of anyone she could have asked. Both of her sisters, she presumed, dyed their hair, but she'd never heard them talking about it. Slowly, as she watched Bernie working with the hairdryer, she realised that she was being given the hairstyle of a much younger woman, and that the women watching it all happen knew that and were taking it in with considerable satisfaction. The more Bernie worked, the more her hair seemed to look like a wig. She knew that the dye would take time to wash out, But in the mirror, she could see how pleased Bernie was with her own work. There would be no point in complaining. "Is it not a bit young for me?" she asked. I think you look great," Bernie said. "The cut is very fashionable at the moment." "Oh, I've never had a fashionable cut before," she said. When it was finished, she knew that anyone who saw her on the way home would think that she had lost her mind, or that she was trying to look like a young woman rather than someone who was recently widowed. "It'll take a few days to get used to," Bernie said, "but no one has grey hair anymore." "Does the dye not look very unnatural?" "In a few days, it will lose that look, and people will think you've had it all your life. You look very worried, but I promise you that by the weekend, you'll be delighted with it. You can't wash it out, can you?" "No, but it will fade, and I guarantee that you'll be back here in a month for the same again. I've never known anyone to go back to the grey. But maybe the next time we'll think of putting some highlights in. They're all the rage now as well." "Highlights? Oh, I don't think so." Outside, she lifted her head high and hoped that all the women in Court Street and John Street would be busy cooking, and that none of them would be standing at the door. She prayed that she would meet no one she knew. In her mind, she went through the worst possible encounters, the people who would most deplore the idea that with her husband 6 months in the grave, she had dyed her hair a colour it had never been before. She thought of Jim, who's her brother-in-law, and knew that she would have to face him and Margaret within a week. They would not know what to think. As she saw Mrs. Hogan from John Street walking towards her, Nora could not tell whether Mrs. Hogan simply did not recognise her, or if she wanted to get by her without making any comment. Just as Mrs. Hogan approached her, she seemed almost to jump. Her face quivered, and then she stopped. "Well, that will take some getting used to," she said. Nora tried to smile. "Was it Bernie?" Mrs. Hogan asked. Nora nodded. "I heard she got some new packets in all right. God, I must go to her myself." If Mrs. Hogan in her apron and a pair of very worn-looking shoes felt that she had the right to comment on Nora's hair, then there was, Nora felt, no reason why she could not comment in reply. "Well, you know where she is," she said dryly, looking at Mrs. Hogan's hair, clearly suggesting that it could benefit from some treatment. It took Mrs. Hogan a moment to take in the possibility that she was being insulted. The encounter made Nora feel brave. She would stop for no one else, but she knew that what had happened was a mistake. She wondered if she'd ever done anything like this before in her life, acted on a whim without any thought for the consequences. Before she was married, she remembered, as she came back from work one day at dinner time, she found a stall of old books outside Warren's Auctioneers at the bottom of Castle Hill. As she perused the book, she found a volume of poems by Browning, one of whose poems she had loved in school. She was flicking through the pages when she was joined by old Mrs. Carty from Boreen Hill. They both checked the price of the book, which was written in pencil on the inside page. It was far too high, and in any case, she had no money. They both walked away and moved together along Friary Place and up Friary Hill. As they parted at the top of the hill, Mrs. Carty handed her the book from under her coat. "No one will miss that," she said, "but don't tell anyone where you got it." Walking home with her new hair dye reminded her of walking into her mother's house with that volume of Browning's poems. It was the same feeling of guilt, the same feeling that someone would follow her and find her out. Quickly, when she arrived home, she boiled some potatoes and opened a tin of peas and put 3 lamb chops on the pan. When the boys arrived, the potatoes were not ready. She waited upstairs, calling down to let them know that their dinner would be a bit late. She sat in front of the mirror at the dressing table and tried to work out if it was anything she could do to her hair to make it look more normal. She wished she had told Bernie not to use the lacquer, which was sticky and had a sweet smell. As soon as the boys saw her, they both became quiet. Donal looked away while Connor moved towards her. He reached up and touched her hair. "It's all hard," he said. "Where did you get it?" I had my hair done this morning," she said. "Do you like it?" "What's under there?" "Under what?" under what you have on your head, what I have on my head is my hair. Are you going to go out with that? He asked. Donal glanced at her and looked away. Thank you.